Welcome, welcome, welcome. Excited to have you here today. Welcome to Beyond the Headlines, Higher Ed and Democracy in 2026. What's happening in higher ed? Um, for those of you I haven't met, I'm Gabe Lerner. I am the founder and publisher of Democracy Notes, and we're thrilled to be co-hosting this event with our sponsor, Lumina Foundation, today. We're gonna give folks a couple minutes to trickle in, and I'll share some logistical details before we dive in. On the logistical front, we are recording this webinar, and folks will get a link to the recording if they registered after the event. Use the Q&A function. We want to hear what's top of mind for you. We want to hear what questions you have for our panelists today. Um, Use the Q&A function and we'll be sure to look through and get to your questions. Um, and then a reminder on the timing of this event. The event is an hour and 15 minutes. We understand if you have to drop at the hour mark, but would love for you to stick around for the Q&A portion, which we'll cut through to the end. Um, and we're thrilled to have, wow, we have a great group on here. I will go ahead and get started with a bit of background on Democracy Notes and then pass things over to you, Terry, to talk more about the event and context around that. So, Democracy Notes is a trade publication, which is a wonky term for a publication for a particular sector or ecosystem or field. And so we're the trade publication for the US democracy space, the set of people who are working on democracy and civic life in the US, whether they're uh, funders, whether they're practitioners, whether they're researchers, whether they're job seekers. And we reach an audience of about 22,000 folks through our newsletters on Substack and LinkedIn. And we also love to put on events like this. We love to highlight uh, interesting topics, relevant topics for our democracy space audience. And we're particularly excited to be diving into higher ed. I personally had not been staying up to speed on all the happenings around higher ed and democracy since the Trump administration, Harvard University back and forth left the headlines. But lots and lots has been happening. So we have lots of questions and we've got a great group to answer them. But to share more on the origin story of this event and our partnership, pass it over to you, Terry.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabe. Really excited to be here. Thank you to you for hosting and to the whole Democracy Notes team. And we have three amazing panelists. I should say most higher ed democracy events don't feature a community college professor, a young leader, and a researcher that thinks about higher ed but isn't at a university. So we've got a really cool group that also happen to all be friends of ours. But Lilith Foundation is a private foundation based in Indianapolis. We also have an office in DC and staff all over the country. And we're focused on raising post-secondary attainment and value in the United States. And you don't hear the word democracy in that statement. So what the heck is someone thinking about college and universities thinking about democracy? Well, one, we can't have a successful education system if we don't have a functioning democracy. And in the United States, like colleges play a special role. Like it's a place where you build civic skills. Increasingly, a college classroom might be one of the only places where you're with people who are different from you and you're sort of all trying to learn together, but you don't actually know everybody. Like we don't have that many spaces like that in the US anymore. Um, College universities are also a place of like significant constitutional protections for free speech. It's a place where, our ideals about our First Amendment rights, like really like have an institutional marker. And for that reason, they're sort of considered a pillar of democracy in a lot of ways. And they also play a lot of community roles. They're a place that hosts community events. They, are a place that people can work. They're a place where oftentimes they're the biggest employer. There's just a lot of roles that college and universities play. And at the same time, that sort of sense of college's role in American democracy and civic engagement needs to connect the America we're in right now and the America that we want to build. And so we've been working at Lumina in a lot of different ways And in our 6 or 7 years of this work, have discovered one, surprise, surprise, there's really big silos in the funder community, especially among grantees. I mean, I didn't hear I rarely hear the word education in democracy spaces, and a lot of times the higher ed democracy stuff sort of assumes that we can solve all the democracy problems within colleges, and both of those are not quite right. And so we've been sort of playing in the knocks and playing in the joints, as the judges say. And that we found this requires translators and minglers like you gave, and people that are just sort of curious. I think that this helps us see the real human impacts of some of the things that have happened to our democracy. I think you'll hear from folks on this webinar. This isn't just like decisions in the Supreme Court or headlines or stuff happening to Harvard, but it's really impacting the day-to-day lives of half, of more than half of American colleges, universities, and their students, faculty, and staff. At the same time, I also hope democracy folks hear that this is an opportunity for solidarity, for community, as we consider how to build a new future and how we want to educate young people, adults, um, alike, towards that. And so I'm super stoked to get to support this work. I remember when Democracy Notes was but a dream. So I will close with that and excited to hand it over to the panel.
It exists now. We did it. Thank you, Terry. I am excited to welcome Jonathan Friedman, who is the Syms Managing Director for U.S. Free Expression Programs at Penn America. Greetings, Jonathan.
Hi, Gabe. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Also, I really like the Freedom to Write poster in the background there. Very cool.
Thank you.
Um, Sue, you are sort of our like Spark Talk expert to kick things off. Uh, but briefly, what is Pen America and what is your job at Pen America?
Sure. Well, PEN America is a 104-year-old literary free expression organization. We celebrate creativity in literature and we defend the civil liberties that make it possible. And we have a particular focus from our charter, which was written and then ratified in the last 100 years, to focus on safeguarding the unhampered transmission of ideas. So I oversee work here at Penn that is really focused on that rather broad concept, but in particular, what it means for schools in the United States, for colleges and universities, public libraries, journalism, and the arts and culture sectors. And all of those are the kinds of areas where we think of that intersection of creativity, truth-seeking, the freedom to write, as you mentioned, but also, the other side of free speech, the freedom to receive information, the freedom to read, the freedom to learn. And we have done a lot of work over the past few years, both chronicling what has been a growing attack on higher education, but really much of civil society and all of the educational, artistic, and journalistic sectors that we represent. And we have done a lot of work also trying to articulate principled guidance for how campuses and other institutions can uphold freedom of speech and can marry that robust protection for free speech with other ideals like diversity and inclusion that we think are all really fundamental to a pluralistic democracy.
So, what one other framing question, to what extent is Pen America like a lawyer organization, suing in defense of folks for the First Amendment as opposed to research or convening or other things?
Yeah, so we're a membership organization
Mhm.
originally, an organization that has members across the country who are writers, and that includes, writers who are poets, who are scholars, who are fiction writers, who are songwriters, who are screenwriters, and it's really that act of writing that binds our kind of core constituency. And we do some legal work, but we also do a great deal of advocacy work, and we have become a real hub connecting connecting these different sectors and trying to, come to shared messaging, to shared understanding of the rising threats and how we can combat them. I think there is much, for example, as we have seen a rise in attacks on universities that can be learned from where we have seen successful pushback against efforts to ban books. And of course, a few years ago, you could talk about banning books in the United States, and that seemed an anomaly, and that spread around. And now what we're seeing is efforts to ban books in colleges and universities. A few years ago, that seemed like an impossibility. The notion that we might have a conversation about students and young people and access to information that we could debate in schools, but that colleges were different. They teach adults. There should be a kind of embrace of open inquiry as fundamental to democracy and the process by which young people find themselves, engage with ideas, etc. And so we are seeing this censorship mentality really spread. What was once confined perhaps to school libraries, it's now really moving and radiating in a lot of directions and attacking that whole infrastructure of civic culture in the United States.
Hmm. So, as I mentioned in the opening, uh, my brain was sort of most engaged in the conversation around democracy and higher education and freedom of expression around the back and forth between the Trump administration and Harvard University. But can you talk a little bit to start about how efforts to exert political control over higher ed looked maybe before that moment and sort of how that's evolved over time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really important point that the Trump administration that began in 2025 changes the calculus of what's going on, certainly raised the stakes, but in particular states around the country, these issues have been worsening for years. Really, it started at the end of the Trump administration with what some might remember as the ban on teaching divisive concepts, so-called list of vaguely articulated forbidden ideas. And that list, which started as a ban for federal contractors, was then adapted into state legislatures. In that same year, we saw a kernel of an idea that was originally floated by Senator Cotton against the New York Times 1619 project. This idea proposed in a Senate bill that, no one really thought was going to go anywhere federally, but it was that the government should threaten to defund a school if it teaches any materials from the 1619 project. And I think it's really important that we pause on that and really consider that today in the United States, there is no law like that. There's no law that is like that for any book or educational resource, with the exception of a law in Texas that passed a few years ago that specifically is against that very specific text. And so when you think about the range of books and things that we, might introduce to students in any kind of educational setting, there's really just one text that has been singled out in this way, and it tells you something about where all of this came from. So you had, on one hand, this vaguely articulated list of concepts. You had this kernel of an idea of the government maybe threatening to defund or pulling new levers against educational institutions to start to impose or restrict, to start at first to restrict what they teach. And from there, it's kind of moved in a lot of directions. In the first year of this 2021, we saw pretty standard bills around the country based on one form of model legislation that was being written in a really, frankly, careless way. This is a bill to prohibit teaching race and gender in any public institution. And you would say, well, is that schools? Is that universities? Is that other public institutions? And the politicians behind it would say, yes, all of the above. And just with very little consideration for what makes, well, higher ed distinct from K to 12 schools. Over time, as we've seen those bills spread, get legally challenged, and peter out, the shift, certainly in higher ed, has been much more now to what I would call indirect forms of censorship. So instead of trying to directly legislate, prohibitions on race and gender, there was a pivot to instead legislate new rules about faculty senates, about shared governance in universities, about accreditation, about institutional autonomy, and about tenure. And for most of us, that is pretty insider's baseball in higher ed to understand what are all those things, why do they matter. But what do they share in common is that it's really the infrastructure that has supported freedom of speech and academic freedom, intellectual freedom, free thought in universities. So if you cannot, in other words, just legislatively ban topics in universities, well, perhaps other mechanisms could be advanced, and which they have been, to exert control. And so, in our most recent report published in January, that was our focus, this expanded web of control. And it really has expanded in like just so many different directions so fast. And it's not always easy to engage in the public or even supporters of democracy and higher ed in a conversation about why we all ought to stand up and defend something like accreditation, which has been non-political for a very long time. And so that is what is shifting in these sectors right now.
So if I'm a person who wants to restrict uh, freedom of expression on college campuses for whatever reason, can you run through kind of the tools available or the tools that have been used to try to do that? Like some that come to mind are, you know, threatening to cut or cutting federal funding if you don't do something that I want you to do. Another maybe is passing a bill through the state legislature. Another's maybe trying to pass a bill through Congress. But what are some of those levers or tools available?
It's a great question. I think the key concept that I've landed on to explain this to people is that there's been a kind of effort to refine the art of censorship. If you think of this as an art or an object in mind, what we've seen is the ability to test out different methods and then refine them, see what works and what works better. And all of these bills, many of them have faced legal challenges. They are almost universally all directly either unconstitutional or involve flagrant violations of academic freedom, and what has made universities in the United States the envy of the world. But nonetheless, the legal challenges are slow, and these ideas sometimes they're being passed into law almost more as messaging bills, right? Like, well, it might be complicated to implement, it might be vague, but more important is to be able to say, you accomplish something, you pass something. And that is really what is driving a lot of this. Now, in terms of tools, it's as you mentioned. We've seen threats to defund. We see threats to penalize. So, for example, if you do X or if you don't do X, you might lose your job. We are seeing all sorts of efforts to change the way that faculty governance once dictated due process. And when I think about democracy, due process, right of law, rule of law, equality, these are core principles which are just being eviscerated in so many universities. So whereas before you might have a faculty committee evaluate whether, maybe your teaching crossed a line and you said something you shouldn't have, or you didn't follow a syllabus, all sorts of things that are reasonable workplace management issues in any institution, that used to have faculty governance as part of it, and we're seeing that undone. And so it's either threats of job loss, threats of defunding. In Texas, we have seen Texas university systems individually now pursue this in a range of ways. So some of those universities are creating new policies and restrictions. UT Austin has decided to abolish a set of its departments related to ethnic and gender studies, and other institutions in Texas and in other parts of the country are doing similar things. Sometimes these are actions that might be within the purview. They may have the power, they may have the legitimate, institutional power to do these things, but nonetheless, there were traditions of faculty consultation, of student, alumni, community consultation. None of that is happening. And so the university as we know it, as many of us know it, is really being challenged in this moment. And so if you're teaching a course and you have to decide, should you answer students' question or assign that text the way you always did if it might get you in trouble? If you're non-tenure, even if you are tenure, frankly, in a lot of places, there is an incredible incentive right now to simply not do it, to not challenge people, to not teach that text that might, incur some controversy. And boy, is that a disservice to young people into students that we think of as future learners. And that's happening across the country. It's happening whether you actually are you could be teaching in a blue state that doesn't have any of these laws, but nonetheless be nervous. And that's how the chilling effect is so much broader than the actual penalties that have been written into these laws.
Hmm. I I did grad school in Beijing, and when folks asked me about freedom of expression in the classroom there, uh, the example that I often gave was faculty were worried about students sort of telling on them for having ideologically out of line views, and students were worried about faculty telling on them for the same reason. And it created this environment mainly of self-censorship. Like the threat was there, but the threat was self-enforced. It was enforced because you weren't sure exactly where the line was or exactly which professors or students, you could trust to be more candid with. And it's been very strange hearing that in the context of American education now.
Absolutely. I mean, and look, even stories like that were happening and have been happening on American campuses. I mean, let's remember here that when we're talking about the university system, the university, college, higher ed system, this is an enormous thing, right? Most people tend to concentrate only on the few elite institutions, elite R1 research universities, but the vast majority of students do not go to those institutions, right? And vast majority go to community college or other public four-year institutions to get degrees. Many students in the country are not residential and living in dorms and the like. And so we're talking about a lot of different kinds of experiences of higher education when we talk about higher education, but absolutely in all of these places, we are seeing that chill happen. We are seeing it affect not just curriculum, but a lot of the time extracurricular. So, for example, should the theater department put on a play that might be construed, let's say it's a kind of historic anti-government play. Well, maybe that might upset the governor of Florida, so maybe our theater department shouldn't put on that play this year. And that is sort of the thinking that we're seeing in more and more places. And when you have the choice, any of us, about courting controversy or sidestepping it, the natural tendency is to try to go around it, try to avoid it, try to put your head down, as I said. And so there's a lot of that happening. I think also just in terms of the long-term health of the sector, and this is really important. 4 or 5 years ago, the conversations around what was necessary for higher education, higher ed reform, what we needed to teach young people were so different. And now the whole conversation has shifted so drastically to a different set of issues that are essentially not just controlling. The curriculum, but controlling the whole concept of what universities can be as sites of empowerment and civic engagement, and equalizers in society. And I think of no better example than this than something like Iowa State, which 4 or 5 years ago, when Iowa, the government in Iowa passed one of these first divisive concepts laws, one of the casualties was something that a faculty senate working group was developing at Iowa State, which was a new set of requirements for courses, basically to mandate a diversity of courses that give students different kinds of skills and achieve certain learning outcomes. And what the provost did at the time, wary, he said, of the new law that was not yet law, but it was about to become law by the governor, was he essentially denied the plan. He said he wouldn't sign the plan that all these faculty had been working on that had been developed through routine, regular channels of faculty governance of curriculum. And ultimately, they did find what some felt was a compromise. They made some of the learning outcomes optional rather than making them all mandatory. But fundamentally, they broke and violated what had been a faculty governance process. Now, fast forward 4 or 5 years later, what's going on in Iowa? Well, right now, Iowa is launching a review and audit of all of its courses for any DEI, however they define it. And they have also instituted these new civic thought centers across Iowa universities and given them the power to set mandatory courses for any student. So, what was once a faculty process of looking at curricula and thinking about the breadth of training that we wanted young people to have, it's now become very politicized, directed by the legislature almost, in a direct line to a center that's been put on campus that isn't necessarily subject to regular processes of faculty approval and development of course material. And so we've moved from, banning and restricting certain concepts to other forms of institutional control that are all being undone or changed. And now we're also seeing these new sort of mandates for what must be taught. So when you pause and you look at that trajectory over 5 years, how else to describe that but an effort to completely remake, okay, to push out and to pull in an entirely different curriculum. And, I am sympathetic as many to this notion of whether college education is still achieving its goals, whether it's still good, whether it does need change. But what I am highly suspicious of is that when that process is being dictated by people who are elected into political office and who have often seem to have ulterior ideological motives at work.
Can you, last question in this vein, could you talk a little bit more about the civic thought or civic education centers on campuses? Because as an outsider to higher ed, but as someone who's in democracy work, my assumption was if I saw, civic education center popping up on a campus, like, great, that's a good thing, that's a potential ally, we should share their jobs in the Democracy Notes newsletter, etc. But it sounds like maybe there's complication there.
Well, it's blurry. I don't want to say that anything with the name civic thought, democracy, etc. in its name should be untrustworthy or anything like that. And there is this politicization of language that's happening as well, where you're sort of saying, well, do you mean civic thought or do you mean civic thought from that, from that perspective? And so a lot of that is contested. It is tricky to know, or to think of this in blanket rules, but it is clear that a whole bunch of these centers have been mandated through laws in nearly identical ways. Sometimes they have been created through endowments from private individuals. Sometimes they have become mandated by state legislatures. But one of the common features is that these centers are popping up on campuses. And now, at first, they were sort of just given the power to create some elective courses or be some programs. And so, why would anyone be opposed to that if you believe in free speech, if you believe in civic democracy on campus? The challenge is that they have often been more beholden to the state legislatures and political interests. And now they're also being granted new powers that aren't being granted to anyone else. So if you think about it, the Center for, I think it's one of these centers for civic thought in Iowa, is now going to be responsible for creating a course on American history for every undergraduate student that goes to that institution.
Hmm.
But that isn't actually the history department making that class. That isn't a group of historians at the department or at the university level contributing to that class. That is a class whose content is about to be essentially set by a unit that has been created inside the university without necessarily having any of the regular processes by which curriculum is set play a role. And so that's what's concerning with all of this, is this sort of outsized power, this question of quality control. I mean, a question of who's going to decide. And like, obviously, curriculum is always contested. We know this, but the best answer that we had developed to that was, and I'm going to return to it, something democratic. You get a bunch of experts together, you work it out, you think it out, you present diverse perspectives. Look, I'm not going to defend every college course in the history of the university that has always done the best job of balancing a diversity of perspectives, but I can tell you that the vast majority of actual intellectual issues do not have a simple Republican and Democratic view. They have more complicated views. They have four views, five views, six views. And so when we start to legislate everything down to you have to have perfect balance in, what is taught, or it has to have the perfect, when it's mandated diversity in a law and you could lose your job if you aren't doing it properly. Well, what does that mean? What is intellectual diversity in the study of, historic anthropology? Who's going to decide? And so all of the laws are vague. People are feeling their speech and academic teaching chilled, and the people who are going to lose out are the students.
Mm. So it sounds like I need to be doing my due diligence and homework to a degree in the processes behind some of these centers. Like, is this something that the state legislature controls directly? Is this something that the state legislature set up? Um, is this something where curriculum is being designed by professors, faculty? Is this something where curriculum is being designed outside of the university or elsewhere? Um, so first of all, troubling, and also thank you for sharing all this. I want to bring two more people into our conversation. Um, Julie White, Chancellor and CEO of Pierce College, and Alex Edgar, Youth 250's co-founder and youth engagement manager at Made by Us. Welcome. Hello. Hi, Alex and Julie. Um, Also, to folks listening to this conversation, reminder, Q&A function if you have questions. We just got an awesome question that I want to be sure to address later on. Um, but Alex, I'd love to start with you. You are not a current student, but you are a recent former student and uh, you work directly with a lot of students. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the student experience on campus right now.
Thanks, Gabe. Happy to be here with all of you. And I think we're going to go from Jonathan's like really enthusiastic, exciting, everything's going super well, to my enthusiastic, exciting, everything's going super well commentary. But yeah, so in terms of when we're thinking about the student experience right now, I think a lot of the focus more broadly is thinking about the, quote unquote, traditional student who's 18 to 22, makes up a majority of 2 and 4 year institutions, as well as the fastest growing population of credential and online university students in this moment. And kind of the first point, kind of like context set of like, what is this generation Gen Z who is in college right now, like what is their kind of framing of how they're experiencing their university experience, right? They are dealing with a ton of overlapping crises, from immigration to attacks on healthcare and SNAP benefits that tend to affect lower income students the most. We've seen massive shifts in terms of support for BIPOC and LGBTQ plus students on college campuses. We've seen an increase in political violence. We have been long tracking the increase in loneliness and social isolation, coupled with the effects of social media on our young people's lives. We obviously have the ongoing trend of affordability in higher education and the ways in which these students often are working multiple jobs just to get by and afford their college education. And as Jonathan was touching on, there's also kind of this broader piece around free speech and the broader surveillance state that young people have grown up on and are entering a college environment in which they really do not feel as safe and connected to their ability to speak freely, protest, etc. And the last thing that, of course, we can't have a conversation about young people or higher education without touching on AI. And the ways in which young people on college campuses right now are really, really afraid of the future, in part due to the messaging of our institutions and our leaders in the field. I was looking at a survey earlier that 70% of college students today view AI as a threat to their job outlook upon graduation. And you couple that with the fact that in the most recent Harvard Institute of Politics Youth Survey, just 13% of young Americans say the country is on the right track, right? So there's really this like overwhelming feeling of, oh my gosh, things are not going well. And when you have that feeling, coupled with the fact that you have those overlapping crises that I was touched on, that we really have a disconnection from like hope, not just in the college experience or college education as a pathway for economic mobility, for living a quote unquote good life, but that fundamentally, I think young people today are in a unique set of crises. And also the other thing I always love to share with folks when we're thinking about, again, what is the framing, beyond what is this present moment, right? So I just talked about the overlapping crises young people are experiencing. What is the like understanding of social change that young people are able to like reach back into? So if you think, I'm 22, a majority of Gen Z is, kind of like 2000 on babies. So thinking about like from, Occupy Wall Street to March for Our Lives to the pandemic and Black Lives Matter, to more recently the Israeli and Palestinian protesters. Young people today have not seen social change in a very linear fashion. They have not had a divestment from South Africa. They have not seen a civil rights movement in their lifetime. So young people, majority of our college students today don't have a frame of reference of their beliefs, their actions, their communities being responded to. And I think that also leads to this greater sense of like disconnection to their universities when they've seen often the repression of free speech, of free protest on college campuses. So I think those are some of the kind of contextual things. And then I want to talk a little bit about like the more hopeful pieces of the student
Thank you.
experience
We're
today.
very much keeping things light and fun on this,
Yeah,
clearly.
super light, super fun. Everything's golden and rainbows. But no, I do think, on the flip side of some of the AI concerns in terms of, economic mobility and job opportunity post grad, there are some incredible opportunities when we see that like AI really, cuts down on the distance between idea and implementation. Right. So the ability for young people to develop, their own businesses, whether it's through entrepreneurship, kind of cutting down on the amount of time that they're doing tasks that might not be helpful to their long-term career and their development as an individual. I think that we're seeing lots of really innovative ideas and solutions to problems, especially ones that are closer to students' lives that are popping up on college campuses across the country. Obviously, we know scientific breakthroughs coming through that, and tons of students involved in research. Although obviously the research landscape is always an interesting moment. I also think that we're seeing, especially post the assassination of Charlie Kirk, a real resurgence in conservative student activism on college campuses in terms of kind of sheer numbers of clubs and students engaged in organizing. That I think it is helpful as we're talking about civil dialogue and connection, and what we know higher education tends to be a lot more liberal. That I think is a positive development, that it invites more conversation. And the last thing is, I think that due to the overlapping crises that young people are experiencing, both on college campuses and in their communities, I do really believe that many higher education leaders and in conversations like this and others I've been having this year are becoming more and more ready for the types of more radical and governance shifts that are necessary for higher education to not just continue playing by the same, kind of toolkit that they've been using for decades that was designed for different learners and a different job market and a different society. And I really do think that there's more and more leaders that are recognizing the importance of innovation in this moment, and that the answer is not just talking about things differently, but actually doing things differently. And I think that's really going to help the student experience going forward.
So we did get some notes of hope and optimism there.
There
Love
always
that.
is.
Always, always. Julie, I'd love to ask you a few questions. Uh, but one to start, Jonathan mentioned how we often think about higher ed as the Ivies or Harvard, but in fact, that's not true in terms of the population proportion of students who are involved in higher education. Could you give us a little bit of the 101 of community colleges and the landscape there, and then also how Pierce College fits into that, geography, et cetera?
Sure, happy to do that. Maybe I'll start by complicating or giving a little nuance to some of Alex's remarks, first of all, which I completely agree with. And what I would also raise up is that community colleges serve a broader swath of humans, and including age range. And so, for example, at Pierce College, the average age of our students is 26. Our youngest graduate this year was 16, and our oldest was 70. And so that's a really rich place to work and to be in community. I think for the 101, it's important to talk about how community colleges emerged, and it's going to be very succinct. But it's important to understand that closeness to communities and connection to civic engagement is really central to our history and our work. We often cite in the community college world the Truman Commission report of 1947, which was one of the really catalysts to expand access to the first 2 years of college. And the Truman Commission saw community colleges as providing an education that is essential to explicitly strengthening American democracy. And so that is a mission that we live every day. And many scholars and advocates refer to us as democracy's colleges. We have, in ways, fallen short. We are not perfect. And I agree with Jonathan that we need to continue to look internally to see how we can do an even better job at expanding that access. But our mission of opportunity, community engagement is really core. And so we were really developed to democratize higher education. If you think about who was accessing higher education before the 1940s, and then just continuing through the 1960s, 70s, and to the present day, it looks very different. And in fact, my colleague Mike Gavin with the Alliance for Higher Education has done some work that talks about how as colleges have become more diverse, it's inverse to these kinds of legislative efforts that we're seeing. And so I think it's important to put it in that really long historical context. And I'm really so grateful to be representing higher education because, as you said, we often are not thought of in this conversation, and we educate anywhere from 40 to 50% of undergraduates in this country. And I would also lift up that while there's a lot of conversation, Yale's report on trust in higher education recently came out, the American Association of Colleges and Universities also recently released a report, and both acknowledge that community colleges are the most trusted sector of higher education because of that, those local roots, affordability, direct engagement with the communities that we serve. And so we're a key community anchor for our regions. In terms of Pierce College, I will just say that we are located in Pierce County, which is where Tacoma is, just south of Seattle. A distinct economy and community. I always have to let people know that. And so we are primarily, in terms of economics, we are primarily eds and meds, as they call them, education and healthcare, and really small and mid-sized businesses. And we are very diverse as a community. Pierce College itself is over 50% students of color. And I can talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So all of this connection to community, industry, local organizations is really part of our DNA. And it is really the work that we do every day.
Julie, could you share a little bit about how the sort of flows that Jonathan described have affected day to day in leading a community college, sort of the political exercise of control, what civic engagement looks like, all that?
Sure. Let's see. I'll address kind of the let me address first what the day-to-day impact is, and then I can talk about some specific examples of how we view civic engagement when you're ready for that. So I have to say that the biggest impact is the absolute destabilization of individuals, communities, and institutions, and specifically higher education institutions. And that destabilization, of course, is coming from the things that we've heard both Jonathan and Alex talk about: immigration enforcement, threats to LGBTQ plus students, threats of defunding if you do or say the wrong thing. And I will add that Pierce College is very explicit in our values around equity, inclusion, and access. And we have not wavered from that, but it is a calculated risk, I guess, that I would say. It's really key to our culture. And we are doing the best to maintain that culture because we believe that's what our students need and our communities need. And then the threat of defunding, also the loss of, or the threat of the loss of institutional autonomy. So things like accreditation, very bureaucratic things like the language and grant agreements that we receive. All of those kinds of things. It's just a constant as a leader, it's a constant, risk assessment. And for our communities as a whole, our students and our employees, it's just this anxiety, for lack of a better word. And again, I think Alex really captured that well. And even just day to day, folks are stressed. There are increases in interpersonal conflicts because everyone's stressed. And has been a real need to, there's always a need to increase communication from leadership. And, you can never communicate enough. And that's like 10 times as true now, as far as letting folks know what's happening, how we're responding. I'm really in the moment. So it's increased the pace of everyone's work. And again, just kind of that level of anxiety. I would then also just note a couple of specifics. One is in 2025, more than 100 TRIO grants nationwide were canceled. And TRIO serves low-income students, students with disabilities, those most in need of resources. The minority serving institution grants were canceled after many of us, including Pierce College, spent a lot of time, energy on putting forward a grant proposal. It was then canceled after that whole competition was canceled. And those grants are often used to build institutional capacity to ensure that we're providing culturally responsive services, direct financial aid support, those kinds of things, advising, transfer support. And so all of a sudden, that funding has been is no longer available to, and again, community colleges are a huge pool of the sector that receives that kind of funding. And the last thing I'll mention, just in terms of the day-to-day and really planning for the future, is that the cuts that we're seeing come from healthcare, for example, and other services from the OBBB are trickling down to our states. And, in Washington, about half of our budget is from the state allocation. And so we're really getting squeezed in a number of different ways. There's more needs for support, and there's less money to go around to make that support happen.
Hmm. Alex, this made me think about a question from the student vantage point. Maybe thinking back to your time in undergrad or thinking about a friend on campus now, uh, what's a decision that a student might make that might be sort of like on the margins of should I do this or should I not do this, where they'd be worried about the current context? Like, I don't know if that's like going to a protest or how to engage in democracy.
100%. I mean, I think there are so many examples and could probably like list out one for every of the major, trends we're experiencing right now. I think, the uncertainty around SNAP, about healthcare benefits, about, access to basic needs for students. Like we have, long known in higher education, the importance of these types of programs to ensure that our students are able to spend more time on campus engaging with the education process and less time, trying to work multiple jobs just to cover their basic needs. And I do think that when we think about the political uncertainty and the ways in which, will I be able to have SNAP next year? Like, am I able to really rely on that? It plays a major role. And as Julie mentioned, like, it's not just kind of like these broader things. Like, we are experiencing large amounts of stress and anxiety in our day-to-day lives in general, right? And then you add in the fact that, you're maybe a first-gen college student who is, you could still be in state at a, university, could be out of state, and trying to figure out like, what would I do? I don't have 6 months of, rent and, needs saved up. Can I really rely on the government, the state and federal government to provide for these needs? So I think that is a major concern for many college students of how much they can rely on government benefits, especially when again the trust in our institutions is at like an all-time low for young people in terms of everything. And I think per Julie's point, like community colleges are a good example of like based in community, deep relationships, help support in many ways that like, a lot of other institutions aren't able to provide and don't provide actually. And then I think also, Gabe, as you kind of touched on it, the fear around immigration, but also job opportunity and broader, like, am I going to get expelled or put on leave at school is a major concern for student free speech and protest. I mean, we have seen actual examples of students being deported, sent to prison, being expelled from their universities as a result of their activism. Excuse me. And oftentimes, the biggest problem that I think comes up is the distance between what university leaders and students, like the conversation around what is normal, what is okay. We've talked about time and place. We've talked about these things a lot since October 7th in particular. That I do think that there is a real kind of chilling effect when it comes to student protests and student speech, both directly on the campus context of like, if I am here, is there a chance that I can get arrested? Someone can have a photo of me that leads to immigration concerns, that leads to trouble with the administration. But then also seeing the ways in which many employers have taken certain stances politically that may reflect on their hiring process, and especially when thinking about first gen students or lower income students who are making the decision between like, is me attending a protest worth potentially giving up my future employment? Right? Like that is a genuine conversation I've had with many college students as they're navigating, like, can I post something I believe in on social media when I know that a future employer or current employer might look to my social media and say that does not fall in line with our policies? So I do think there very much is a chilling effect that kind of has these ripples also, and like there's a reason why I think there's been many a think piece about why are students not protesting this year? Why is there not anti-Trump or anti-whatever protests on college campuses as much as there was in 2024? And I really do think that when our universities showed students how they respond to protest, students listened. They remember, and even if they were not on college campuses when that happened, I really do think that has had some repercussions in at least this kind of like batch of students in higher education and their willingness to engage more broadly.
That's not great. I guess I think about protest, freedom to assemble as a First Amendment right, and uh, uh, it seems like a valuable one to protect, and troubling to hear, like universities, the administration, etc., constraining civic space in that way. I'm going to start to bring questions in from the audience Q&A, and so audience, a reminder to engage through the Q&A. Would love to directly answer your questions. One question that we got from Jean was, how do you inform and encourage students to use their voice to vote? And Julie, I'd love to ask a twist on this question to you, which is like, what does civic engagement look like in community college land? As someone who, I do value voting is important, voting is good. We want students to vote, we want all people to vote. And also, I know that a lot of the attention on my campus was directed to voting in particular.
Yeah. Yeah, voting's absolutely important, an important outcome of civic engagement. But I think of it, so we talk about student retention, how do we help students be retained? And I'm going to make an analogy here. You can't just work on retention. You have to provide all the supports, resources, removal of barriers so that people both can and want to stay at college. Same with voting. You have to provide the supports, the resources, the knowledge, the skills, the sense of agency that makes democratic participation seem like a way that folks want to spend their time. So we certainly, at community colleges, like all of higher education, we are required to promote voting, although of course, we've seen some nuances to that to try to limit some of that. But that is an important part of our mission. What I would say is that our work beyond voting is that deep civic engagement and participation, responsiveness to community needs. Looking at, for example, for us, looking at our data and who are the students and populations that we have served least well, and then directing resources in terms of outreach, access, retention, community engagement within those specific areas. For us, we're targeting, focusing on specific zip codes where we know there's a lot of need for economic and social mobility that we could help support. And then I would also say that we are doing a lot of work to bring the college to the community and the community to the college. One quick example is we're working with our local organization that supports Latine and Indigenous Native folks, and they have now opened an official office at one of our colleges that will bring community members on, will provide support to students, and build that kind of partnership so that we're not separate, and to make that even more explicit. Those are the kinds of things. And one more, as I'm looking at Alex, is to involve students and student leadership. And we're very explicit about that. We take students to Capitol Hill, we take them to Olympia, our state capital, and it's a really important part of student development and of the work that we do. All of those things and many more, but a few examples, I think, of thinking about this broadly, so that people really believe that democratic participation not only matters, but makes a difference.
Um, I'm going to read the next question in full, and anyone who wants to respond, feel free. Um, Amy shared, I run a statewide college student civic engagement organization in Pennsylvania, and we've seen a huge uptick in obstruction from campus administration, particularly at private institutions. At one school, the provost emailed every professor, calling us out by name, saying we could not speak in classes. Professors have made fun of students for trying to help their classmates register to vote. Are there opportunities to build power together to return campuses to the space they used to hold for building and deploying young political power?
I may not have all the answers on that one, but what
You'll solve it. That's great.
but well, I'm gonna connect some threads here because I do think the educational mission of the institutions that we're talking about has never been more important to democracy. And we can talk about civic engagement, et cetera, but in some ways, what we're also talking about is civic education, right? One of the things that has been very apparent over generations is this, we do a lot of work on free speech and free speech education, and who even knows what that is anymore? One of the issues I think that does impact that may be playing a role on this campus, the campuses in Pennsylvania, but certainly in when we think about like students today on campuses, they actually don't necessarily have much of a grounding in the First Amendment. And we know there's been, a decline in how the public in general understands the First Amendment over some time, but we can't expect that students arrive to college campuses with much knowledge of their own rights as citizens, with their like just fundamentally their right to vote, fundamentally their right to an education, their right to freedom of speech, to freedom of assembly, etc. And it is so important that we think about and use the opportunity of higher education to give that kind of baseline understanding to everyone who walks through that door. And that's how we build back democracy, and in a more pluralistic and a more equalizing fashion. And I think it's really important to divorce that from that mission and that work from any particular political objectives, because I think when it starts to mingle so strongly with particular political objectives, well, it's harder to get collective support. It's harder to see it as something that is important for the collective good for us all, right? Those notions of community and the ways that, and the social bonds. And I think that, to this question about like campuses and their administrators and what they're doing, all over the place, we are seeing an abuse of power with little respect for freedom of speech or for freedom of dissent. And that climate is only getting worse. I think it is something that a lot of people in higher education and in the democracy space understand that we need to address together. One of the projects that we're rolling out later this year is going to be a video for campuses to adopt to explain freedom of speech to all incoming students. It's something that we're going to be launching in October. It's had a ton of buy-in from a lot of universities, but we're trying to think in our work, not just about how we stand up in opposition to these efforts to censor campuses, but how we develop more resources that a greater number of campuses could use fuse together because there's just been a dearth of enough resources and recognition of those common problems. And, like as you mentioned before, Julie, the AAC&U report and others that are looking at the common challenges with public trust, the common challenges that we need more common solutions for people to work to find together.
I two quick things I want to like plus one and add on with what Jonathan just shared in response to Amy's question. I think the first thing is on this idea of civic education and like what do the students, but also faculty, administrators, community members, people on social media, the general public responding to things happening on college campuses. Like the level of civic education, incredibly important. And also I think the reality is if you are learning about the Constitution, if you're learning about free speech, if you're learning about any of these foundational documents and principles, and then especially thinking about younger audiences who are pulling out their phones, maybe scrolling on TikTok, on Instagram, maybe on Twitter. And are actively seeing examples both here in the U.S. and obviously abroad who don't have the same protections of these very principles being, broken, being, walked all over, walked around, I think it is difficult to, preach about civic education when we are living in a moment in which these founding principles aren't being followed. And I think that's an important thing. I think a lot about, I know FIRE always asks students like, what percentage of them are like, have discomfort expressing views on a controversial topic or alternatively like feels comfortable with controversial speakers on campus. And we know that like we're really like at an all-time high for people just saying like, no, don't bring that here, which, on one hand, free speech, right? But also on the other hand, like how are we showing young people in particular, but all of us as Americans, when our leaders are not following some of these foundational principles, it is hard, especially for educational institutions to turn around and say, no, 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 but this is the way things are supposed to be done.
I'd like to add one quick thing, which is from a leadership perspective, I'm of a board that fully embraces this work. And want to make sure you can still hear me. I just got a message.
Yes.
Like I'm good.
Yes.
Okay.
Good. Yeah.
And so it's, not all presidents, chancellors have that. And for there's a specific influence. For us, it would be the Washington State Legislature, for example. For a private institution, there are levers of influence in terms of boards, alum associations, and so on. So leaders can, also, we're also trying to keep our jobs so that we can serve and help advance this mission and this work. And it can get really tricky to navigate those dynamics.
Mm. I was wondering that before because I imagined that Washington State would be less of a hostile environment for some of these things, but you never know. And that's good to know. We got a really great question from Caroline Chang. How can government, state or federal, better partner with institutions? Um, Basic needs, so I'm thinking SNAP, etc., but also connecting value of credentials with career paths. And are there areas that are better suited for philanthropy to help build capacity when higher education is being politicized?
Maybe I'll just jump in with some opening thoughts. There was a lot there that I was pondering. In terms of
Oh, Julie, we lost you for
On
a
the
sec.
edge of our
sorry about
seats.
that. My apologies.
All good.
In terms of local and state government, I do think there are things that they can do to help subsidize and also philanthropy. And I don't want to minimize that. I will also say we are hugely reliant on federal funding, whether it's through student federal financial aid or student grant, federal grants and contracts. So we can't make a quick turn in that way. It is, however, important to start to build those partnerships. And the great thing is when you build partnerships with your local governments, again, you are engaging with your community, you are responding to the needs of your community. And there is absolutely a huge role for philanthropy, Lumina, who is sponsoring, this opportunity for us to have this conversation, and many other good projects. So I'll start with that, and hopefully I won't jump off the Zoom unexpectedly again.
I mean, I'll just say, like, there is a really great history of government involvement in higher education. That's not on its own, right, a bad thing. When you think about, the long-term partnership between the federal government and the research engine of universities and science, what that created, though, was the system, as you said, Julie, where it's so vulnerable. And, the number of people, I mean, I think it will be years before we are able to comprehend the amount of knowledge, the amount of ongoing projects that were disrupted by the Trump administration in just about every scientific field imaginable. Because even scientists who ultimately got their grants, a lot of them had to change their plans. A lot of their plans got mixed up. I mean, the paperwork complexities, the bureaucratic complexities that have been created around all of this, are not easily undone. And that relationship between universities in particular and the federal government around research funding was, as you said, like extremely one-sided in a sense. They became very reliable on them. I think also it's where we have seen this also easily politicized. Like when you are at the whims of state funding for your institutions, and those state legislators in charge are now threatening that funding or conditioning it upon ideological diktats, yes, they might be violating cardinal notions of the university. Well, they're obviously violating them as independent from political power and political thought and political priorities. But nonetheless, practically, what do you do in that situation? And it is, we are seeing just how difficult it is to navigate that. I think one of the other things that I was just going to put a link to this in the chat here. I was talking earlier about education, and we here at Penn, we really believe in the importance of explaining these issues to people. So we put a lot of thought into pieces like this one. So we talked about accreditation before. If you want to understand why is that accreditation in such a really vulnerable spot right now, and what could that mean, and why could that mean so much? We've tried to lay it out here, but I think this is where philanthropy can have a positive influence, and where, the answer to all of this shouldn't be that government should just, go away and leave higher ed alone. But there used to be opportunities for partnership. You used to start with what are the common problems and what are our solutions. Instead, what we've had is for a number of years here, governments coming with with some kind of solution to stop ideology on campus, etc. All guise for essentially cracking down on free speech and academic freedom in the way they have.
In a slightly different vein, uh, poll workers, great question from Jen Stein. Are What do y'all know? I think there's probably a lot of collective wisdom on this call, both panelists and attendees around this, but what institutional partnerships are you aware of, sort of credit bearing or otherwise, that are recruiting students to poll work? Or is that generally more ad hoc? Maybe that's one we can also follow up with, because I know that there are really good partnerships on this, and I can anecdotally think about a couple university examples, but want to do the digging on that first.
The one thing I don't have like an exact answer to this question, but I will say I think it would surprise many of you how many of these universities don't have polling locations on campus, or have polling locations that are off campus, not in accessible places for most college students, let alone in thinking about residency requirements, voter registration requirements, et cetera. And so I do think like the poll worker piece, incredibly important. And it's great if your community or your university is already at that spot. I very much know, and even when I was at UC Berkeley, we had a multi-year kind of back and forth between student leadership and administration just to get a polling location on campus, due to concerns about space and funding and all those fun things. And that's obviously at a large public university that should have a bit more access. So all that to say, I do think poll worker is incredibly important. I do think that there are some universities that have great kind of communications around that, but I will say I think like especially given some of the changes in the voting rights world over the past month, that increased focus on just like, do our students have access and education to what's going on, is to me like the preeminent concern.
I mean, let's imagine that, you arrive on a college and part of your orientation package or something in those first 6 months is like, here's how you vote here. If you're from out of state, here's how you register, right? Like for some, universities have never really seen this as really their jobs to do. And yet we know that young people would in greater numbers vote and participate civically in elections if it wasn't so, like if they weren't scheduled when they have exams, or if they, or whatever it is, if it was just, it is, we know that there's been an effort to make this harder to the point Amy raises also in the chat, that universities have been opposed to this. And, we know that there are all sorts of challenges with elections, et cetera, and democracy that go beyond what universities could do. But at a basic level, just as I said, you can't expect a student arriving at 18 to necessarily have much knowledge of free speech, of democracy, of how to study, and of how to vote. Like, why not make that something universities commit to doing?
I just want to say that it is in the Higher Education Act that we are required to provide voting information to students. Recent statements and moves by the administration have, created some intimidation around that. For example, we were told that students who are being paid by federal work study funds cannot do voting outreach, which, is being challenged, of course, but we are required to do that. I do think that the extent to which colleges and universities put resources and emphasis on that has ebbed and flowed over the course of our history, and we are definitely in an ebb because of the language of intimidation that we're seeing. And I did want to note that I think that several colleges do provide service learning credit and connect some kind of voting outreach with an academic course, and connect the co-curricular and curricular content there. And yeah, I think many of us are, again, especially publics, community colleges, regional access universities, are poll sites. And so we are, and really proud of that. But again, that really varies.
I love that. Um, One quick plug for folks attending. We're going to have a survey. There's a survey that'll pop up as you exit the Zoom. Please do fill that out. We really appreciate hearing your feedback. Um, and to close us out, a huge, huge thank you, Jonathan, Alex, Julie, for your wisdom, for your time, and Terry, Lumina Foundation. Very grateful for making this event possible. Thank you all so much.